Hi, everybody. Welcome to part two of our video about reading disabilities, including dyslexia. We talked about some challenges that individuals with reading disabilities often face in areas like phonemic awareness, word identification, and fluency. The fourth challenge area is reading comprehension. And reading comprehension, of course, and this is something that actually is sometimes debated about what its actual definition is, but I think a decent definition is it's the ability to interpret the meaning of a text and make appropriate conclusions based on what was read. Usually, although not always, reading comprehension depends on those first three elements being present, that a person has phonemic awareness or phonics skills, or both, that a person has word identification skills, both in terms of phonics skills and in being aware of those words that don't follow the rules of phonics in English, and that a person is a fluent reader. Those are usually considered sort of prerequisites for reading comprehension. But reading comprehension is also its own thing. And you can have a person who is very strong at phonics, who is a very fluent reader, who can pronounce every word imaginable, but they still might struggle with comprehension for a variety of reasons. In general, and I think this comes up later in the presentation, but I'll just share right now, in general, students in high school are more likely to struggle with comprehension. Those first three areas are more likely to be struggles for students in elementary school. And over the years, many students overcome those struggles. So a student who struggled with phonics in first and second grade with quality instruction is going to overcome those struggles. A person who struggled with fluency in fourth and fifth grade with quality instruction overcomes those struggles. Doesn't mean that no high school students will struggle in those areas. In fact, those you teach probably can think of students who do. But the area that high school students and adult learners, for that matter, are most likely to struggle with is comprehension. How prevalent are reading disorders? This is controversial. People don't agree. The numbers I most commonly see in books written for special education are from 4 to 8% of school-age children have some sort of reading disorder, and not all of those students are necessarily in special education for a variety of reasons. Again, not all students with a reading disorder necessarily also have what's called a specific learning disability, much less dyslexia. But on the other hand, again, this is controversial data, some advocates for people with dyslexia claim that the rate is much, much higher, and I've seen in other sources as high as 17%. My personal feeling is that it is not 17%, but I maybe it is, maybe I'm wrong. I had a professor who I respected quite a bit when I was an undergraduate, and this was sort of after the first round of dyslexia really made it into the popular consciousness in the 80s and 90s, who argued persuasively to me, but you can disagree, that dyslexia was highly overdiagnosed at the time. And his example was this. He said that students read what they want to read, and if they want to read it, they can read it. And he gave the example of students who wanted to drive have to take a written test, and that written test, especially then, I'm sure now as well, but especially then, required that you read and understand the driving manual. And similarly, hunter safety at the time, and I don't know what hunter safety is like now, but required a written test among other things, and you had to read and understand like the hunter safety manual, the hunting, guidelines and rules and laws. And he pointed out that nearly in that community of the Twin Ports, the Duluth and Superior, nearly every 15, 16-year-old who wanted to drive took and passed the driving test. And there was, a huge majority of students, and very similarly for students who wanted to go hunting, took and passed the required tests there. And so he argued that if they really had dyslexia, they would not be able to pass those tests. I think he makes a point. And I think that, and I will come back to this later in the course, one of my real concerns is that as we have re embraced the science of reading and as we have sort of re embraced the idea of dyslexia, we're starting to throw out independent, self selected student reading. Um, and that is unfortunate. And that is, I think, is going to have some very negative consequences down the road if something isn't done. Now, that's more of an English thing than an everyone thing, like the rest of it is, but it's something to think about. We know that reading disorders, reading disabilities are higher in urban areas because poverty is a risk factor. We know that being surrounded by text, by print, by having parents who read to you, siblings who read to you, family members and other carers who read to you, and who will just play with language with you, are very important in learning to read. They have a positive effect. And as I mentioned, elementary students tend to struggle more with fluency and word identification and phonemic awareness, and older students tend to struggle more with comprehension. Finally, here are some signs of dyslexia. These are signs that are true for both upper elementary school, middle school, and high school. Students who are slow in gaining reading skills compared to their peers. So let's say for the few of you who are going to be high school or middle school English teachers, if you are teaching a reading related skill in your class, that is, a refinement of past learning or whatever, students who struggle to gain those skills compared to their peers, that might be a sign they have dyslexia particularly. Students whose reading is slow and awkward, and again, here we are assuming that they are a native speaker of English or that they have fluency in English and that they don't have an issue of a speech or language impairment. Students who have trouble with unfamiliar words, a very common thing that started to emerge in sort of screeners for reading issues, are having students read nonsense words, like, I don't know, slurple. Slurple would be purple without the initial P and an SL instead. And so a student who sees slurple and reads it probably is at least, I shouldn't say probably doesn't have dyslexia, but they're like that's a good sign. A student who sees slurple and guesses that it is, I don't know, German Shepherd, like that wild guess, that's a sign there might be a reading issue going on. If you ask a student, if you come across a word that you have never seen before, what do you do? And they can't answer you. They can't, and if you give them even the example, they can't explain their thought process. That might be a sign of dyslexia. Students who very vigorously avoid reading aloud, and students who confuse words while they're talking that sound alike. Those are all potential signs of dyslexia in upper elementary school, in middle school, and in high school. I do want to conclude by, I think we talk about fluency later in the course a little bit more. I have to look it up to see, I guess. But I want to mention right now for things like fluency that that requires repeated oral readings of things. It is widely considered by nearly everybody to not be a good practice to force students to read text material out loud in what is sometimes was traditionally called round robin reading and is sometimes now called popcorn reading. Those are instructional practices that are not supported by research. And you can find research to support most instructional practices. I don't think you can to support popcorn reading or round robin reading. It is something to avoid. And that's hard to avoid sometimes. I will admit, particularly when I was a substitute teacher, I engaged in it because students were willing to do it. And don't get me wrong, some students truly like it. The problem with it is that it puts students sort of on the spot. They are reading unfamiliar text. It might be one thing if it were an assignment that students had already read, and then you're coming back to it and it's like a second read or even a third read, then it's probably appropriate. Um, the problem with those sorts of approaches are that students, particularly both students who are nervous about reading out loud but also students who are excited about reading out loud tend to focus on trying to guess when their turn is going to be rather than focus on what's being read. It like students tune it out. And students who don't tune it out um, have sort of trauma over sort of mild trauma at least over it. The students who engage in it, um, it's not a good instructional practice. I like to remind students of that because it's probably something you have gone through as a student. It might be something you're seeing in your classrooms during field experience. And I don't judge a teacher for doing it. I judge teachers for very few things that they do, and I don't judge them for that. But it is something to try to think about what are ways you can um, change that up so at least it's not a whole class thing. It is better to do it in a small group, for example, than it would be to do in a whole class. Anyway, there's my reminder of you about popcorn or round robin reading, that it's something at least at the whole class level to try to avoid. Thanks for watching. If you have questions, thoughts, you want something else explained or discussed, please let me know. I'm happy to take requests.